Our world has been upended by the coronavirus pandemic, and our churches are struggling to adapt to a Sunday without face-to-face worship and the passing of the offering plate. The United Methodist Foundation of the Northern Illinois Conference is offering a 4-part workshop with the Reverend Dr. Michael Piazza on how to execute practical changes in stewardship and focus your church on a clear vision for the future. I spoke with Reverend Piazza, founder of Agile Church, along with Reverend Chris Walters, head of the United Methodist Foundation of the Northern Illinois Conference. Welcome to both of you. We're so glad to have you both on different drummers.
Thank you, Jan.
Yeah, Chris, why this 4-part session now? What are churches and church members experiencing financially during this pandemic?
Well, I had reached out to Michael, at the end of last year. Every year we look for a professional, an expert in church renewal and generosity to come in person and do a full-day stewardship summit with usually about 200 to 250 people in our annual conference. And then we've been doing that for several years, and it's always very exciting, and people learn a lot from that, and then they go back to their church, and then it kind of gets lost in the ether of normal church operations. And so this year presented a real challenge because we just couldn't do that. We couldn't gather in person. It became clear early on. As I talked to Michael, I thought, this is an opportunity for us as the foundation to do something that is more sustained and is more engaging on a one-on-one or one-to-group cohort or coaching basis. So that's what we're developing with Michael, to work with the churches of the Northern Illinois Conference, the Methodist Church, to help them adapt to these changes that you've mentioned.
Reverend Piazza, what do you mean by an agile church?
Well, we very deliberately named our consulting business that because one of the things that is really clear, particularly about mainline churches, is they have got to figure out a way to streamline their decision making and their response time. I do think that this pandemic and having to almost instantly, with almost no notice, figure out a new way of doing church has taught us that the church is capable of doing it. And so we can make more of the changes that the 21st century require. Often I talk about the fact that the church sort of views itself, especially in the main line, as sort of all of us sitting together in inner tubes or rafts and gently floating down the river. But in the 21st century, it's much more a whitewater world, where change is happening so quickly.
Turbulent, yes.
And the churches are not geared, organized, or prepared to do that. And I'll say particularly my own, I grew up a United Methodist, but here I'm a United Church of Christ pastor, and that congregational system has become encrusted with traditions that just make many of our churches incapable of adapting, and hence they are dying.
You call the traditional mainline churches vintage churches. Why that word? It could be a good word or a bad word.
Yeah, well, most of the church growth folks have gone to calling mainline churches old line churches, and I hate that. And then to call it a mainline church, well, to use the United Methodist Church as an example, the conference I was ordained in, which was the South Georgia Conference of the United Methodist Church, that conference is very different from the Northern Illinois Conference. Now, Northern Illinois United Methodists are pretty mainline. South Georgia Methodists are very evangelical. And so sort of to lump them together, it just wasn't working. So what I thought the way it came to me was, and I tell this story in my book, my daughters, for one of my birthdays, gave me a gift, and I pulled it out of the wrapping paper. I have it here with me. I pulled it out of the wrapping paper, and they had given me my grandmother's phone handset. And I kind of looked at it, and they kind of looked at me and rolled their eyes because they were teenagers at the time, and then reached across and pulled it all the way out to show me that it plugged into my iPhone. And that's what I mean by vintage. They're millennials now. One is there in Chicago. And they would come home from college or whatever, and I would go clothes shopping with them and buy them new outfits. And they always wanted to go to the Goodwill or the vintage shops. And so it began to trigger in me the fact that generation that churches are trying so desperately to reach really do have different values than we attribute to them. And so, you know, they did some surveys, the Barna survey, for example, and again, a very conservative group, but the Barna survey showed that an overwhelming majority of millennials preferred a sanctuary to an auditorium. So what I mean by that is churches that have pews and sanctuaries and stained glass windows and sing hymnals and have organs, that's not the problem. That's not why millennials are not coming back to church. And so we've got to figure out where the problem really is. And so these sort of vintage churches have great value, I think, in that. But it is figuring out, like, we can sing the old hymns, but we've got to learn to sing them to a faster beat, and we've got to learn to use a different rhythm, and we've got to be more ethnically diverse in our music. And this white European hymns being all we sing, that's just not going to cut it. We can sing hymns, so you don't need to throw that out. But we've got to figure out what the real need of the culture is, particularly for the next generation who is going to inherit the church from us.
Well, Chris, we have been thrown into turbulence, the whitewater, as Reverend Piazza said, in the Northern Illinois Conference, where we went from our worshiping in our churches to online church. What kind of impact has this had across the conference?
I think first I want to talk about what I think is ironically a positive impact.
Please, go
ahead. And that is, it has very quickly jolted us into a theology of the church as the people. Mm-hmm. We grew up teaching our little kids in Sunday school that the church is the people. And then when we grow up, we kind of conform to this theology of the church as that place where we go to worship and do Sunday school and have committee meetings and so on. And I think what we've learned very quickly is that we can still meet each other through technology. Perhaps we can drive around and gather in smaller groups on someone's front yard. Perhaps we can do church worship out on the front yard of the church, where drivers passing the church can see all those people out there clapping hands or worshiping in a way that they find comfortable and exciting. So that's the first positive impact I think that has happened. And I think what has been challenging is the inverse of that, is that we can't gather in the flesh. I know here in Northern Illinois, Bishop Sally Dick started a theological conversation in our Facebook group talking about online communion. And kind of the consensus grew up that we should fast from having communion because we can't gather in person. Well, that lasted 1 month. And now I think most churches are doing some version of online communion. So even that sacred cow, if I could call it that, has been questioned and has been viewed, I think, again, more as a communion with the Holy Spirit, with Jesus Christ in the elements, that it's still communal, even if it is through technology. So it might be jarring for some people, but I think many people have embraced that the meaning and the symbolism and the actual communion with the Holy Spirit is still present there in our tradition.
It is one of the ways we're finally, I think, convincing people of the priesthood of believers.
Yes.
That, you know, that they can actually serve themselves communion, that they are sacred people. And the other thing for us, at least, was, you know, like most churches, mainline churches, my congregation in New York City has a lot of elderly people and infirmed people and people who live alone. And so as this started, the thing we did was mobilize the deacons in our church, and they all have been assigned a certain number of people to stay in touch with at least twice a week. And when we gather for Zoom, if those folks are not there, then they sort of share with the community, you know, what's going on with them, where they are, what, you know, that they're doing, or that they're doing well, they just don't have technology, or those sorts of things, so that the Zoom coffee hours become much more a community hour, where, you know, where we really do share our burdens and concerns. And that didn't happen when we were together in person.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent point. The technology has actually found a way to bring us together and to make us more intentional
Yeah.
We dearly miss our sanctuaries, our churches, being there in person, but we have found ways to connect even during this really difficult time. So what does that mean for the churches going forward, for these mainline churches? Are they going to survive? What does the future look like?
Well, for me, so I teach congregational renewal at Hartford Seminary and have for the last, I guess, 8 years. And one of the interesting things is that in all my consultation and all my teaching, the one thing I've been emphasizing for 8 years is technology, to get the church outside the walls. Now, suddenly I'm a genius. And so people are calling me all the time to try to help them get technologically up to speed. And the other question they always have is, so what does the future look like? And the truth of the matter is, none of us know. I mean, I realize that as a professor of congregational renewal at a research institute, I should be the one who knows, but I haven't a clue, because this has changed so much and then changed so continuously that it's impossible to predict. Yelp says that 40% of the restaurants in New York have closed permanently.
Wow.
And so a lot of restaurants will go out of business and won't come back. And I think that'll be true about the churches. But they'll probably be mostly the churches that were really on life support before. That is, churches who were dependent on an endowment or renting their building or a couple of elderly, generous donors who didn't really have a congregation able to sustain them into the future. There probably is not much of a future for those congregations. But that gives the church, with a capital C, an opportunity to renew itself in those communities, like where a congregation dies. There isn't any reason that we can't plant something new with young people. And I think the other thing that's going to happen is that the model of church going forward is going to be a hybrid model. So I think that people think that when the pandemic is over or a vaccine arrives, that we will go back to church as normal. I mean, that's an illusion that will not happen. My parents, who are both nearly 90, will never go back to church in person. They can watch their pastor on TV. He can come by and visit them, or other people can come visit them. But it would be, I mean, they get that because of their health problems, it would be deadly for them to go and even catch the flu. So now that they can do church in a safe way, why wouldn't they? And young families with children, they'll go back immediately. But after a few Sundays of pulling their hair out, trying to get everybody ready and in the car and to the church on time, they're going to say, why don't we have brunch and watch church online? And that's what they will do. They will either watch our church online or they'll watch another church online. That's part of the trend of consumerism that has affected the church, that people are going to shop around. And some of them have been watching their own service so they can see their own people, but they've been watching other services. And so there's going to be this. So at our service, we have about 100 of our regular folks from the local congregation every Sunday, but we have up to 1,000 people who participate or watch the service live or later recordings of it. So, and almost none of those church people are from New York City. We have a huge cluster of folks from Texas, which is where I served. But we've got 2 young people who worship with us every Sunday from London. Now, that would have never happened before.
What about here in the Chicago area? What's happening with
I think,
churches?
as Michael says, the future is always uncertain, and we humans want to think that we can somehow divine or pull out the crystal ball and see what's going to happen in the future. I think some things are clear because trends have been established, and he's talked about this in his books, that the church is becoming less participatory on Sunday morning, where you might have had a certain segment of the population that were coming every week or 3 times a month. Now maybe they come twice a month, or if they were coming 4 times, they come 3 times, or if they came 2 times a month, then they come 1 time, and then those impact the numbers. And when we obsess over the numbers, it I think gives a false sense of how many people are actually connected to the church. So I think the future portends for the church that it really has to become more of a place of networking and infusing meaning in people's lives, because they're already socializing in so many other places, whether it's Rotary or the gym or the PTA group at school or in the workplace or just with friends and family and other social institutions than the church. The church then, because the church is the people, the job of the church and church professionals like myself need to infuse meaning into the church community, that is all church. Wherever they go, they are being the church. And that the church, like for instance, here in Glenview, where my wife is the pastor, there's a preschool and a daycare, and kind of the headquarters of the daycare is in the church, but they have multiple sites throughout the school system. And they both pay rent, and that's a great thing. But those are really ministries of the church, because the church building and the church community provides space to these organizations that they couldn't get at the cost. But the interesting kind of benefit of that is that people that work there and the kids that go there, they kind of see it as their church, even though they're not there on Sunday morning. And there are numerous examples of stories I could tell about where those little outgrowths come from those people that are connected to the church building because they work in the preschool or the daycare. And then you kind of get an identity in the community that, oh, that's the church that has the Wesley daycare. That I think should not be underestimated, that anything the local church community can do to integrate itself into the larger social fabric of the community that surrounds the church, the physical church, is going to be the future of the church. It has to be, because if it's not going to be, then we just persist with this kind of inward looking four walls of the sanctuary. We show up for once on a Sunday morning, and that's it. It has to be more than that. It has to be integrated in the social fabric of the community.
One of the things that churches absolutely need is money. How has giving looked during this pandemic time?
It depends on the church. Some churches that have solid recurring givers, whether it's automatic quote unquote bill pay where a check gets automatically issued from their bank account, or they have their credit card set up through some kind of technological platform. Those churches that have already done that work and put that into place, they're doing very well. And then a lot of churches have shifted quite dramatically because they were asked to go online and set up their giving that way. They have been successful. My concern is that the churches that really are the very highly vintage traditional churches where they don't have any of that in place and people only give when they come on Sunday morning, those churches really are faced with, they have to change. They have to embrace these ways. It's 2020. Most of those people that give a check on Sunday morning are probably paying bills or doing something online electronically with a bank account, is my guess. Michael, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Even the older people. So this is a major thing that my consulting company does, is to go in and try to say, this is your last pledge drive. You're not going to do pledge drives anymore, because everyone knows that they're harder and harder, and there's more and more effort to get less and less money out of fewer and fewer people. And pledging really turns millennials off, especially when you connect the pledging to the budget. They want to see their generosity as a spiritual practice, not as bill pay for an institution. And that's really offensive to them. Mm-hmm. So what we really have to get people to shift to is, like my daughters, when they were 12 or 13, I went down with them, opened a checking account with them. They got a debit card, and I gave them a fairly substantial offering, about each of them $250 a month. But they had to pay absolutely everything out of that, including $25 to the church on Sunday. Now, that was now 15, 18 years ago, and they still, neither one have ever had a checkbook. They haven't owned a checkbook. Wow. And so my youngest daughter, who went to the University of Georgia, which was only 75 miles from the church I was pastoring, worshiped with us often. And she would say, Daddy, you say, no matter who you are, where you are on life's journey, you're welcome here. But when the offering plate passes, that's not true. I have no way to give, because you don't take my debit card nor your credit card, which she had. And so how am I supposed to participate? And she was exactly right. We keep saying that in vintage churches that we want everybody to feel welcome, but that's one of the major things we've done that doesn't make them feel welcome. So one of the major things I hope I can help with in the Northern Illinois Conference is to help churches figure out how to get from this weekly offering to online giving to recurring giving, or to what I like to call sustaining membership.
Amen.
So
that's great. Well, last question for each of you. Sorry, we're running out of time here. What is your prayer for the vintage churches?
For me, at least, it really is that as hard as I tried to get churches to adapt to being change agents and able to change, as much as I've tried to work on getting them to use technology as the tools of ministry, I had limited success. There were a number, hundreds of churches who went from pledge drives to recurring giving. But even so, probably half of those we consulted with jumped halfway over that river. And, so my hope is that this pandemic really will help the church be more agile and adaptive and relevant to the 21st century. Be more, we all say everybody's a minister. But this has forced us to make it true. And when we go back, I hope we don't unmake it. That suddenly the pastor's the one who comes riding on a white horse every time someone gets sick or whatever. And that we use the tools that millennials are very accustomed to, all of which have a screen on. And so we're going to need screens in our sanctuary, and we're going to need to live stream our worship. But I can't imagine anything more boring than sitting there watching the average worship service in America live streamed for an hour. We're going to have to reinvent worship too, to make it relevant and dynamic and engaging, not only for the person sitting in the pew, but the person sitting in the screen behind them.
I would want vintage churches to embrace their vintage identity. As Michael said earlier, churches that are vintage / traditional, that have pews, they have hymnals, they have a choir, they have pulpits. I think I've met a lot of millennials over the years that they're looking for something that is vintage like that because they already have their cell phone, their social media and all that. And so they would expect a hybrid experience in the vintage church. They want to have an authentic worship experience. They do not want to be sold a commodity or a popularization, a conformity to popular culture version of worship. They want a hybrid, authentic, energizing worship that is also vintage, because a lot of them do seek the connection to history and tradition because they want to raise their kids in something that has that kind of staying power, that gives them a sense of being grounded in community.
It teaches them healthy, humane values. And where else do you learn those except at church?
Yes.
Amen to that. Well, our thanks to Reverend Michael Piazza and Reverend Chris Walters. I'm Jan Engmeyer for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Stay safe, be well, and most of all, keep the faith.